The lock clicked, and the sound echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. Jinseo pressed his back against the door, his chest heaving, his cedarwood and black pepper pheromones rolling off him in waves so thick the air itself seemed to darken. On the other side of the living room, Tae Kang stood frozen, a roll of revised blueprints clutched against his chest like a shield. The Omega's vanilla and white tea scent should have been invisible, buried under the suppressants he had started swallowing again in secret. But tonight, it was pouring out of him, sweet and desperate and utterly uncontrollable, betraying every single word he had just spoken. "I said let me out, Jin." "I heard what you said." Jin's voice was low, almost gentle, which made it more dangerous. "I also heard what your scent is saying, and those two things don't match, Tae. Not even close." Tae's jaw clenched. His fingers trembled around the rolled blueprints. He could feel it, the traitorous warmth spreading from his core, the heat building behind his eyes and in his throat, his body screaming for the exact alpha he was trying to walk away from. Weeks of renewed suppressants, weeks of rebuilt walls, weeks of convincing himself that distance was the only safe option, and his body chose tonight to betray him. Of all the nights in the world, it chose the one where Jin had finally demanded the truth. "Open the door," he said again, but his voice cracked on the last word, and they both heard it. Jin didn't move. His dark eyes tracked Tae the way a wolf tracks movement in snow, patient and absolute. "Not until you tell me the truth. Not the excuses you've been feeding me for 3 weeks. The real reason you're pulling away." The real reason. If only it were that simple. If Tae told the truth, everything would unravel. The career he had clawed together from nothing, the identity he had built like armor around himself, the lie that had kept him alive since he was 17 years old, and his father had looked at the designation results and said, with perfect calm, "No son of mine is an Omega. You will fix this, or you will leave this house." He had left the house, and he had been running ever since. Before we dive in, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. It really encourages my work and helps me bring you more stories. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. I read every comment. Now back to the story. 6 months earlier, Tae Kang walked into the glass tower of evergreen architecture on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying a portfolio that represented 8 years of 60-hour weeks and a secret that could end his career in a single blood test. Portland was damp, the kind of persistent Pacific Northwest drizzle that turned everything silvery and soft. Tae liked it. The moisture in the air diluted scents, blurred the sharp edges of pheromone signatures, made it easier for an Omega on industrial-grade suppressants to pass as a beta. He had been doing it since college, had perfected it, really. The right brand of scent neutralizers applied to his pulse points every morning. The carefully calibrated dose of suppressants that flattened his cycle into non-existence. The deliberate cultivation of a reputation as cold, precise, and utterly uninterested in designation politics. In architecture, where alpha partners still dominated the corner offices and Omega architects were quietly shuffled into interior design departments, being a beta was the only safe middle ground. Betas didn't trigger protective instincts in clients. Betas didn't get pulled off construction site visits because of safety concerns. Betas got judged on their work, period. Tae's work was exceptional. At 30, he was the youngest senior associate at his previous firm in Chicago. His residential designs had won 2 regional awards. His thesis on sustainable urban housing for mixed designation communities had been published in 3 journals. He was, by every measurable metric, exactly the kind of hire that Evergreen Architecture's new managing partner would want to poach. What he hadn't expected was that the new managing partner would be Jin So. The name had floated through industry circles for months. Tech billionaire pivots to architecture philanthropy. The So family, Korean-American, old money from a semiconductor empire, had acquired Evergreen as part of a broader investment in sustainable development along the West Coast. The eldest son was taking the helm personally. Unusual for a family that typically operated through boards and proxies, but the architecture press loved the narrative. Visionary alpha brings fresh capital to struggling firm. Tae had rolled his eyes at the articles. He had met plenty of alpha executives who swept into creative industries with money and confidence and zero understanding of the actual work. They lasted a year, maybe two, before getting bored and moving on to the next vanity project. He would do his job, build his portfolio, and leave before the new management inevitably imploded. That plan lasted approximately 45 seconds. He was in the lobby, signing in at the front desk, when the elevator doors opened and Jin-So stepped out, and every cell in Tae's body went perfectly, terrifyingly still. It wasn't his appearance, although that was striking enough. Tall, lean, with the kind of sharp jawline and dark eyes that belonged on magazine covers rather than construction sites. It wasn't even the way he moved, fluid and unhurried, as though the building belonged to him, which technically it did. It was his scent. Cedarwood and black pepper, layered with something deeper, something smoky and warm that cut through Portland's damp air and the lobby's industrial ventilation system, and Tae's 3 layers of scent neutralizer, like they were made of tissue paper. The scent hit him in the chest, in the pit of his stomach, in the gland at the base of his throat that he had spent a decade pretending didn't exist. His knees softened, just barely, just for a fraction of a second, but enough that his hand shot out and gripped the edge of the front desk. No. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Scent compatibility was a biological curiosity, not a life-altering event. It happened to other people. People who hadn't spent their entire adult lives building walls between themselves and their designation. People who hadn't trained their bodies to be silent. "Mr. Kang?" The receptionist was looking at him. "Are you all right? You look pale." "Fine." He released the desk, straightened his shoulders, forced his scent glands to clamp down so hard he felt the pressure behind his ears. "Just the flight. I'm still adjusting to the time zone." "Of course. Mr. So is expecting you in the 4th floor conference room. Shall I show you up?" Tae looked toward the elevator. Jin had already disappeared into a hallway, his scent trailing behind him like smoke after a candle is blown out. Lingering, warm. Tae could still taste it on the back of his tongue. "I can find it myself," he said. "Thank you." He took the stairs. 4 flights, enough to clear his head, enough to remind his body who was in charge. By the time he reached the conference room, his breathing was steady, his scent was locked down, and his face was the same mask of professional competence he had worn for 8 years. Jin was already seated at the head of the table, reviewing blueprints spread across the surface. He looked up when Tae entered, and their eyes met, and something passed between them that Tae refused to name. "Tae Kang." Jin stood, extending his hand. "Your Portland waterfront proposal was the best submission we received, by a significant margin." "Thank you." Tae shook his hand. Brief, professional. He did not think about the warmth of Jin's palm or the way cedarwood bloomed where their skin touched. "I'm looking forward to the project." "So am I." Jin held his gaze a beat too long. Then he released his hand and gestured to a chair. "Sit. We have a lot to discuss." They discussed the project for 2 hours. The Waterfront Commons, a mixed-use development designed to integrate affordable housing with commercial space and public greenways. It was the kind of project Tae had dreamed about in graduate school, the kind that could define a career. Jin's vision was ambitious but grounded, informed by a genuine understanding of sustainable design principles that surprised Tay. This was not a bored billionaire playing architect. This was someone who had done the reading, who understood load-bearing calculations and zoning variances and the political minefield of affordable housing development in a rapidly gentrifying city. Tay found himself leaning forward, sketching modifications on the blueprints, arguing passionately about setback requirements and community garden placement. Jin listened, challenged, conceded points with grace, and pushed back on others with evidence. It was the most intellectually stimulating conversation Tay had had in years, and it terrified him, because every time Jin smiled at a particularly sharp observation, Tay's suppressants seemed to thin, and a thread of vanilla escaped through his defenses. He caught it quickly each time, pressed it down, buried it. But he could see Jin's nostrils flare, just slightly, each time it happened. Could see the alpha's pupils dilate for a fraction of a second before professional composure reasserted itself. Jin knew, or suspected, something. After the meeting, Tay retreated to his new office, closed the door, and sat with his forehead pressed against his palms for 5 full minutes. This was manageable. Proximity sensitivity was common when an omega encountered a highly compatible alpha. It would fade as his body adjusted. He would increase his suppressant dose, add an extra layer of neutralizer, maintain strict professional distance. Jin was his employer. Tay was a beta. That was the story, and he would hold it until it became true. The first 3 months were a masterclass in controlled agony. Tay threw himself into the Waterfront Commons project with the kind of obsessive focus that had defined his career. He was at his desk by 7, gone by 9. He redesigned the community spaces 3 times until they achieved the delicate balance between privacy and openness that the neighborhood association demanded. He fought with contractors, charmed city council members, and produced renderings so beautiful they made the local newspaper's front page. And every day, he worked alongside Jin So. Jin was at the office nearly as often as Tay, which was unusual for someone with his portfolio of responsibilities. He could have delegated, could have managed from a distance, but he chose to be present, to walk the site personally, to sit in on design reviews with Tay's team. And he was good. Frustratingly, undeniably good. He understood materials, understood structural integrity, understood the way light fell through a space and how that affected human behavior. He asked questions that made Tay think harder, see angles he had missed. Their arguments became legendary in the office. 2 stubborn minds, one alpha and one supposed beta, going head-to-head over cantilever dimensions or rainwater management systems. The rest of the team learned to schedule meetings around their debates, which could last hours and were, according to the junior architects, better than anything on television. What nobody saw was what happened when the arguments ended. The moments when the room emptied and it was just the 2 of them, surrounded by blueprints and cold coffee. The way the air would shift, Jin's cedarwood deepening, Tay's vanilla threatening to surface. The silences that lasted a beat too long. The looks that lingered. Jin began doing things that Tay refused to interpret. He brought coffee to Tay's office in the morning, always prepared exactly the way Tay liked it. Oat milk and a single shot of espresso, even though Tay had never told him his preference. He left sticky notes on Tay's blueprints, small observations or questions that were clearly just excuses to continue their conversation. He made sure Tay was included in client dinners, senior meetings, and industry events, positioning him not as a subordinate, but as a creative equal. And once, on a late night at the office when everyone else had gone home, he had found Tay asleep at his desk, and instead of waking him, had draped his own jacket over Tay's shoulders and left. Tay had woken to cedarwood and black pepper soaked into the fabric pressed against his cheek, and his body had responded with such immediate, devastating warmth that he had to lock himself in the bathroom for 10 minutes to regain control. He returned the jacket the next morning, folded neatly, without comment. Jin took it back with a look that said he knew exactly what that jacket had done and that he had left it on purpose. "You worked too late," Jin said. So do you. I own the building. What's your excuse? The same thing it's always been. The work matters. And nothing else matters? Tay met his eyes, held them, felt the pull like gravity, like something deep in the earth was trying to bring them together. Nothing else can afford to matter, he said quietly. Not for me. Something flickered in Jin's expression, not hurt exactly, more like recognition, as though he understood that Tay was telling him something important, something encoded in the space between words. He nodded slowly. The waterfront proposal review is Thursday. Get some sleep. And he walked away, taking his cedarwood scent with him, leaving Tay standing in the empty office with his hands shaking and his heart hammering and his suppressants working overtime to contain the vanilla that was trying to flood the room. The crack appeared in December. Portland's winter brought darkness by 4:30 in the afternoon and cold that seeped into the bones. The waterfront commons was under construction now, steel rising against gray skies, and Tay visited the site daily to oversee progress. It was during one of these visits that everything began to shift. He was on the third floor of the partially completed structure, reviewing framing with the construction foreman, when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he hadn't seen in 4 years. Father. The word sat on his screen like a stone. I know you're in Portland. Your mother's memorial is in 3 weeks. You will attend. This is not a request. Tay stared at the message until the letters blurred. His mother had died when he was 19, 2 years after he left home. Stomach cancer that moved fast and merciless. He had found out from a cousin's social media post 3 days after the funeral. His father hadn't called, hadn't even sent a text. Tay had grieved alone in his college dorm room, curled into a ball with a pillow pressed against his face so his roommate wouldn't hear. Now, 12 years later, his father wanted him at a memorial service, which meant his father wanted something. Jay Kang never reached out without an agenda. Tay's scent spiked. Not vanilla. Something bitter like burned sugar, the smell of an omega in distress. The foreman wrinkled his nose and stepped back involuntarily. Mr. Kang, you feeling okay? Fine. Excuse me. He walked to the edge of the open floor where plastic sheeting flapped in the wind and the city spread out below in shades of wet gray. He breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way the counselor in college had taught him. The distress scent faded. The burned sugar dissolved into cold December air. But the damage was done, because behind him, standing at the top of the stairwell where he had been reviewing structural plans with the engineer, Jin So had caught every molecule of that scent. Tay didn't notice him until the meeting that evening. They were in the conference room, just the two of them, going over the revised budget. Jin was quieter than usual, watchful. His cedarwood was subdued, held close, the way an alpha's scent contracted when they were trying not to overwhelm a distressed omega. Tay realized what was happening and felt ice crystallize in his veins. You were at the site today, he said carefully. 3rd floor? I was. How long? Long enough. Jin set down his pen. Tay, that scent on the 3rd floor? That wasn't a beta scent. The room contracted. The air became a physical thing, pressing against Tay's ribs. He could hear his own pulse, loud and uneven in the silence. I don't know what you think you smelled, but I had a protein bar that disagreed with me. It happens. It doesn't happen like that. Jin's voice was gentle but immovable. I've been around betas my entire life. I know what beta distress smells like. What I smelled today was omega. You're wrong. I don't think I am. Tay stood. His chair scraped against the floor, sharp and sudden. This conversation is inappropriate. You're my employer. My designation, whatever you think it is, has no bearing on my work. I'm not questioning your work. Your work is brilliant. I'm asking if you're okay. The sincerity in his voice was worse than an accusation. Tay could have fought an accusation. He could have deployed anger, indignation, the righteous fury of a professional whose competence was being challenged. But Jin wasn't challenging him. He was worried. And that tenderness, that careful alpha concern bleeding through the cedar wood in soft, warm waves, nearly broke Tay's control entirely. "I'm fine," he said, and his voice was steady, and his scent was locked down, and only his hands, hidden beneath the conference table, were shaking. "I appreciate your concern, but I need to get back to work." He left the room, walked to the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and when the doors closed, he leaned against the wall and pressed both hands against his neck glands so hard he left bruises. The days after that meeting were a minefield. Jin didn't bring it up again, but his behavior shifted in ways that only an Omega would notice. He stopped wearing cologne, stripping away the artificial layer that might have masked the natural comfort signals in his cedar wood scent. He made sure the conference room was never too warm or too cold when Tay was working there. He adjusted meeting schedules so Tay was never alone with large groups of alphas. Small accommodations. Protective accommodations. The kind an alpha instinctively makes for an omega they're drawn to. It was infuriating. It was also, in the private spaces of Tay's mind that he would never admit to anyone, the safest he had felt since he was 17 years old. The second crack came at the company holiday party. Evergreen hosted it at a restored warehouse in the Pearl District, all exposed brick and string lights and local craft cocktails. The firm was small enough that the gathering felt intimate, maybe 60 people including partners and clients. Tay arrived in a charcoal sweater and dark jeans, having debated not coming at all, but knowing his absence would raise more questions than his presence. Jin was there, of course, moving through the crowd with the easy charisma that made people gravitate toward him without understanding why. He was wearing a dark knit sweater that made him look approachable, almost soft, a departure from his usual tailored suits. "I didn't choose architecture because I love buildings," Jin said, swirling his glass. "I chose it because buildings are honest. You put steel in the wrong place, the structure fails. There's no politics in physics, no favoritism in load calculations." "That's probably the most romantic thing I've ever heard anyone say about structural engineering," Tay said before he could stop himself. Jin looked at him. Really looked at him, with an openness that made Tay's breath catch. "You're different when you're not guarding yourself." "I'm not guarding myself." "You're always guarding yourself, every second of every day. And I keep wondering what you're protecting." The vanilla slipped, just a wisp, thin as silk, curling from Tay's collar before he clamped it down. But Jin was close enough to catch it, and his pupils dilated, black, swallowing brown, and his cedar wood flared with something hot and involuntary. Neither of them moved. The party pulsed around them, laughter and music and the clink of glasses, and they stood in their private corner and breathed each other's air and said nothing for 5 full seconds that felt like a year. "Tay," Jin said very quietly. Don't. Tay stepped back. The distance hurt like tearing adhesive from skin. Please, don't. He left the party without saying goodbye, sat in his car in the parking lot with the engine running and his forehead on the steering wheel. His scent was everywhere, vanilla flooding the enclosed space, sweet and panicked and so obviously Omega that he wanted to scream. He took an extra suppressant, waited 20 minutes, drove home. That night, lying in his apartment with the lights off, he made a decision. He would leave Evergreen. The project was far enough along that another senior architect could take over. He would apply to firms in Denver, in Austin, somewhere far from Portland and Cedarwood, and the way Jin said his name like it was something worth savoring. He started the resignation letter at midnight. By 2 a.m, he hadn't written a single word, because every time he tried, he heard Jin's voice. You're always guarding yourself, every second of every day. And the part of him that was tired, the part that had been pretending for 13 years, the part that remembered what it felt like to be held in his mother's arms before the world told him he was wrong, that part whispered, what if you could stop? He deleted the empty document and went to sleep. January came, and with it, the memorial. Tay flew to San Francisco on a Friday morning, telling the office he had personal business. He wore a dark suit and a matte scent patch on each wrist, the heavy-duty kind designed for Omegas working in alpha-dominated industries. His father's family home was in Pacific Heights, a Victorian that had been in the Kang family for 3 generations. Tay hadn't set foot inside since he was 17. Jay Kang opened the door himself. He was older, grayer, thinner. His alpha scent, once overwhelming in Tay's childhood memories, had mellowed with age to a dull sandalwood. He looked at his son for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You came. You said it wasn't a request. It wasn't. The house smelled the same, lemon polish on dark wood. His mother's absence was a physical thing, a space in the air where her scent should have been and wasn't. The memorial was intimate, just family and a few close friends. Tay stood at the back and watched his father deliver a eulogy that was precise, measured, and entirely devoid of genuine emotion. Afterward, when the guests had filtered out and Tay was moving toward the door, his father stopped him. Stay. It was an alpha command, subtle, woven beneath the word like a wire beneath silk, but unmistakable. Tay's Omega instincts flinched. His body wanted to obey, wanted to go still and soft and compliant the way it had been designed to. He did not go still. He turned slowly and met his father's eyes. Why? Because I've seen your work. The Portland project. It's exceptional. The compliment was so unexpected that Tay couldn't process it. In 17 years under this roof, his father had never once called anything he did exceptional. I've also heard, Jay continued, that you're passing as a beta. The floor tilted. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult me, Tay. I have contacts in every major firm on the West Coast. I know your designation. I've always known. The question is whether your new employer knows. The threat was invisible but absolute. His father hadn't changed. The man who had forced his 17-year-old son to choose between his identity and his home was still operating on the same principle. Control through information. Power through leverage. What do you want? Tay asked. The Kang Foundation is launching an architecture initiative. Affordable housing. Very public, very philanthropic, very good for the family name. I want your name attached to it. As what? Your token Omega success story? As my son, who happens to be an accomplished architect. The irony was so bitter Tay could taste it. You threw me out for being an Omega. Now you want to use my Omega status for good press? I'm offering you an opportunity to come home. This was never my home, not after you made my designation a condition of belonging. His father's scent shifted, just barely. A crack in the alpha composure that revealed something Tay hadn't expected. Not anger, regret. I made mistakes. Yes, you did. They looked at each other across 12 years of silence. Then Tay picked up his coat and walked out of the house for the second time in his life. He flew back to Portland that night, sat in the airport terminal with his phone in his hands, staring at Jin's contact information. The impulse to call was so strong it felt like thirst. Not for the alpha, for the safety the alpha represented, for the specific, particular quality of cedarwood and black pepper that made the frightened Omega inside him go quiet. He did not call. He texted. Landed. Back in the office Monday. The response came in 40 seconds. Good. The East Wing cantilevers need your attention. Also, I saved you a cinnamon roll from that bakery on Hawthorne. It's in the office fridge. Tay stared at the message, and for the first time in 13 years, his eyes burned with tears. A cinnamon roll. This man, this alpha who could buy the entire bakery chain, had saved him a pastry because he knew Tay liked cinnamon. When had he learned that? How had he noticed? Tay pressed his phone against his chest and breathed, and the answer to both questions was the same. Jin had been paying attention. From the beginning, quietly and consistently, he had been paying attention to every small detail of who Tay was. Not the professional mask, not the beta performance, the real person underneath. And that realization was more terrifying than anything his father had ever done. February was the breaking point. It started with the flu, or what Tay told himself was the flu. The chills, the fever, the bone-deep ache that made every joint feel like it was wrapped in hot wire. He worked through it for 3 days, popping ibuprofen and drinking ginger tea, and ignoring the way his scent neutralizer seemed to be dissolving faster than usual. On the 4th day, during a design review with 6 people in the conference room, his suppressant failed. There was no warning. One moment he was presenting revised floor plans, pointer in hand, voice steady. The next, a wave of heat rolled through him so violent it buckled his knees. His scent erupted, vanilla and white tea flooding the room in a single, overwhelming surge, and every head snapped toward him. 2 alphas at the table stiffened. An Omega intern's eyes went wide with recognition. And Jin, who was seated at the far end, went completely, dangerously still. Excuse me. Tay's voice came out strangled. I need a moment. He made it to the hallway, made it to the stairwell, made it halfway down the first flight before his legs gave out and he sat down hard on the concrete steps, sweat beading on his forehead, his entire body vibrating with the unmistakable onset of a heat that his suppressants had been delaying for 13 years. The stairwell door opened above him. Go away, Tay said without looking up. Whoever you are, please go away. It's me. Jin. Of course it was Jin. The cedar wood rolled down the stairwell like warm water, and Tay's body responded with a full-body shudder, his scent glands opening, vanilla pouring from his neck and wrists in waves he couldn't control. Don't come closer. His voice was a rasp. I'm serious, Jin. Stay away from me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Jin sat down on the step above him, leaving exactly enough space that their bodies didn't touch, but his scent still reached Tay like a blanket being drawn over cold shoulders. I'm not going to touch you, Jin said. His voice was strained, his alpha instincts clearly fighting against the command he was giving them. But I'm not leaving you alone in a stairwell during what is very obviously a heat. I'm not. Tay's teeth clenched. I'm a beta. You're an omega, Tay. You've always been an omega. And right now, you're going into a heat that's been suppressed so long it's hitting you like a freight train. And you need help. I don't need help. Your scent is saying otherwise. He was right. Tay could smell himself, could smell the desperation in his own vanilla, the pleading sweetness that was an omega's biological distress signal. His body was begging for an alpha, specifically, catastrophically, for this alpha. I've handled worse, he whispered. I'll handle this. You've never handled this. You've hidden from it. There's a difference. Jin's voice was gentle but unwavering. I have a car downstairs. I'll take you somewhere safe. Your apartment, a heat clinic, wherever you want. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. But you're not sitting on these stairs alone. Tay looked up at him. Jin's jaw was tight, his hands gripped into fists on his knees, his cedar wood carefully modulated to project calm despite the fact that his pupils were blown wide and a fine tremor was running through his shoulders. He was an alpha sitting 2 feet from an unbonded omega in heat, and he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. For Tay. He was doing it for Tay. My apartment, Tay said. Please. The car ride was 7 minutes of exquisite torture. Jin drove with both hands on the wheel, his jaw locked, his scent deliberately pulled in as tight as physically possible. Tay pressed himself against the passenger door, arms wrapped around his middle, shaking. The vanilla filled the car despite everything. Sweet, pleading, undeniable. Neither of them spoke until they reached Tay's building. I'll walk you to your door, Jin said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He walked Tay to his apartment on the 3rd floor, stood in the hallway while Tay fumbled with his keys, hands trembling so badly it took 3 tries. When the door finally opened, Tay stepped inside and turned. They looked at each other across the threshold. Jin's control was fracturing. Tay could see it in the way his hands were pressed flat against his own thighs, in the rhythm of his breathing, deliberately slow and measured, in the dark heat banked behind his eyes. Tell me to leave, Jin said, and I'll leave. I don't need you. The words came out automatic, rehearsed, the same words Tay had been saying to every alpha for 13 years. I can handle this alone. I've always handled it alone. But his scent, God, his scent was screaming. Vanilla and white tea pouring off him in waves that contradicted every syllable, flooding the hallway with a sweetness so desperate it was almost painful. His body was calling Jin's name in the only language biology understood. Come closer. Stay. Don't leave me. Please. Jin inhaled sharply. His eyes closed for just a moment. When they opened, they were molten. I heard what you said, he murmured. But I'm listening to what you can't say. And then he stepped inside and locked the door. Wow, you've made it this far. If you're enjoying the story and still haven't subscribed, please take a second to do so. It means a lot. Also, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from. All right, let's get back to the story. What happened behind that locked door was not what either of them expected. Jin didn't touch him. Not once. Not even when Tay's heat crested and his body curled in on itself on the couch, trembling, drenched in sweat, his scent so thick the walls seemed to absorb it. Instead, Jin filled a glass with cold water and set it on the coffee table within Tay's reach. He found blankets in the hall closet and stacked them nearby. He closed the curtains, turned down the lights, and sat in the armchair across the room with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed, his cedarwood deliberately softened to project nothing but calm and safety. He stayed all night. Tay drifted in and out of feverish consciousness, aware of Jin's presence like a lighthouse in fog. Steady, unwavering. There. At some point in the small hours, when the heat ebbed enough for coherent thought, he opened his eyes and found Jin still in the chair, awake, watching him with an expression that held no desire, no possession, only something quiet and fierce that looked like devotion. "You're still here," Tay whispered. "I told you. I'm not leaving you alone. Your board meeting, it's at 8. They can wait. Jin. They can wait, Tay." Silence. The heater hummed. Rain tapped against the windows. Tay's heat was receding, the worst of it passing, leaving him wrung out and fragile and terrifyingly bare. "I've been lying to you," he said, "since the day we met." "I know." "Doesn't that make you angry?" Jin lifted his head. "It makes me sad. Because whatever happened to you was bad enough that hiding felt safer than being yourself. And I can't be angry at someone for surviving." The words cracked something inside Tay's chest, a wall he had built when he was 17, brick by careful brick, mortared with fear and reinforced with silence. It didn't crumble all at once. It just developed a crack, thin as a hair, but deep enough that light could get through. He told Jin everything. The designation reveal at 17, his father's ultimatum, leaving home with a duffel bag and $200, the shelter that took him in, the counselor who helped him get scent patches and suppressants, the scholarship that got him into college, the years of pretending, the constant vigilance, the exhaustion of performing a gender designation that wasn't his, the career he built on a lie, the mother he lost without getting to say goodbye. He talked for an hour. Jin listened without interrupting. When Tay finished, hollowed out and raw, Jin said one thing: "Thank you for trusting me." Then he stood up, went to the kitchen, and made breakfast. Eggs, toast, sliced fruit, simple food, prepared with careful attention, placed on the table with a cup of ginger tea. The domesticity of it, the normalcy of it, after a night of physical and emotional upheaval, undid Tay more completely than any grand gesture could have. He sat at his own kitchen table and ate the food Jinso had made him, and he did not pretend. He did not suppress. He let his vanilla scent fill the room, soft and warm and unmasked, and Jin's cedarwood rose to meet it. And for the first time in 13 years, Tay Kong existed in the same space as another person, as exactly who he was. It was the most terrifying and beautiful morning of his life. Jin left after breakfast. No pressure, no expectations, just a quiet statement at the door. "Take as long as you need. Your job is safe. Your identity is safe. Nothing changes unless you want it to." Tay spent 2 days alone, cycling through the residual waves of his heat and processing the earthquake that had restructured his inner landscape. When he returned to the office on Thursday, Jin was at his desk, reviewing blueprints, and looked up with a small, careful smile that asked nothing and offered everything. They didn't talk about it, not directly, but something had shifted between them, a tectonic realignment that changed the gravitational field of every interaction. Jin's protective accommodations continued, but they were no longer disguised. He made sure Tay had the conference room with the best ventilation. He scheduled their one-on-one meetings at the end of the day when the office was empty and Tay could let his scent relax. He brought coffee every morning and lingered, not long, just enough to fill the room with cedar wood and let Tay know he was there. Tay stopped wearing the heavy-duty scent patches. Then, 2 weeks later, he switched to a lighter suppressant, one that managed his cycle without completely erasing his omega scent. The vanilla crept back into his daily life, subtle but present, and if anyone in the office noticed, they said nothing. Portland was progressive. Designations were supposed to be irrelevant in the workplace. But they weren't irrelevant to Tay and Jin. They were the unspoken current beneath every conversation, every shared look, every accidental brush of fingers over blueprints. The first kiss happened in March, on the rooftop of the Waterfront Commons building during a late evening site visit. They had been arguing about the rooftop garden layout because they always argued. It was how they communicated. When the sun dropped below the horizon and the city lights came on, and Jin stopped mid-sentence and looked at Tay with an expression that said he was done pretending that this was only professional. "I'm going to kiss you," he said, "unless you tell me not to." Tay's heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Every instinct, every fear, every memory of his father's voice telling him that omegas were lesser screamed at him to step back. He stepped forward. The kiss was soft, almost tentative, which was absurd for an alpha of Jin's presence. His hand came up to cup the side of Tay's face, thumb brushing his cheekbone, and the cedar wood wrapped around them both like a declaration. Tay's vanilla surged in response, sweet and willing and so relieved it bordered on anguish, as though his scent had been waiting 13 years for this exact mouth and couldn't believe it was finally here. When they pulled apart, Tay's eyes were wet. "I'm terrified," he said. "I know. This could ruin everything." "It could also be the best thing that ever happened to either of us." They stood on the rooftop, the city glittering below, the half-finished building rising around them like a promise, and Tay let himself lean into Jin's chest, let the cedar wood surround him, let his omega instincts, starved for 13 years, drink their fill. And for the first time in his adult life, he didn't feel like he was pretending. Spring was a revelation. They moved slowly, carefully, building their relationship with the same precision they brought to their architectural work. Foundation first. Structural integrity before decoration. Jin understood, without being told, that Tay's trust was earned in inches, that the omega who had spent half his life hiding could not be rushed into openness. They had dinners together, sometimes at Jin's loft in the Pearl District, sometimes at Tay's small apartment in Hawthorne. Jin cooked Korean food from his grandmother's recipes, braised short ribs and soybean paste stew, and savory zucchini pancakes that filled the apartment with warmth and made Tay remember, distantly, what home had once meant. On weekends, they walked along the Willamette River, arguing about zoning laws and brutalist architecture, and whether Portland's food cart culture was genius or chaos. Jin held Tay's hand in public, a quiet declaration that made Tay flinch the first time and settle the second, and eventually reach for Jin's hand first, because the cedar wood steadied him in crowds, because the alpha's presence at his side made the world feel navigable. In May, Tay stopped taking suppressants entirely. The decision terrified him. Without suppressants, his omega scent would be fully present. His cycles would return naturally. There would be no more hiding, no more plausible deniability, no more beta mask. He would be an omega, visibly and verifiably, for the first time since he was 17 years old. He told Jin first, then his direct team at Evergreen, then in a company-wide email that he rewrote 11 times, the entire firm. The response was overwhelmingly supportive. Cards, messages, a hand-delivered bouquet from the Omega intern who had recognized his scent during the conference room incident and had been too afraid to say anything. The managing director of operations, himself a bonded Omega, stopped by Tay's office and said simply, "Welcome. It's about time." Tay sat at his desk that afternoon, surrounded by flowers and kind words, and felt the last section of his wall crumble. Not with a crash, but with a sigh, like a held breath finally released. And then his father's lawyer called. Jay Kang was challenging the terms of Tay's maternal inheritance. His mother, before she died, had placed a modest trust in Tay's name. Nothing extravagant, maybe $200,000, but it had been his mother's money, her way of providing for the son she couldn't protect. His father had let it sit untouched for 12 years. Now, through a legal technicality involving Tay's fraudulent designation documents, he was moving to have it reclaimed. The message was clear. You disobeyed. You came out as Omega. Now there are consequences. But the lawyer conveyed another piece of information that turned Tay's blood to ice. Jay had also filed a complaint with the Oregon Architecture Board, alleging that Tay had obtained his professional license under false pretenses by misrepresenting his designation on his application. If the board investigated and found that Tay had lied about his beta status, his license could be revoked. His career, everything he had built, could be gone. Tay didn't tell Jin, not immediately. The shame was too deep, too tangled with the old wound of his father's rejection, the ancient belief that trouble was always his fault, that love was always conditional, that the moment someone saw the full picture of his mess, they would leave. Instead, he pulled away, came to the office early, left late, buried himself in work, kept his scent controlled and his demeanor professional. When Jin reached for him, he found reasons to step back. When Jin suggested dinner, he had deadlines. When Jin texted at midnight a simple, "thinking about you," Tay stared at the screen until it went dark and didn't reply. He told himself it was protection. If Jin got tangled in a legal fight with the Kang family, the So name would be dragged into designation politics at the worst possible time. The Waterfront Commons was approaching its final construction phase. Investors were watching. A scandal involving the managing partner's Omega boyfriend and a fraudulent licensing complaint would be ammunition for every competitor and critic. Better to pull away now. Better to end it cleanly before it got ugly. Better to go back to being alone, because alone was a state he understood, a shape he could survive inside. The Omega who had just learned to stop hiding was hiding again. And this time, it was worse, because now he knew what warmth felt like, and the cold was unbearable. He went back on suppressants. The lighter dose at first, then heavier when the lighter ones couldn't contain the stress. He stopped eating lunch, then breakfast. His body fought the renewed suppression, and his vanilla would spike at random moments, sour and distressed, breaking through the chemical barrier to fill his office with the scent of an Omega in anguish. He would clamp down, swallow another pill, press his palms against his desk until the trembling stopped. One evening, alone in the office, he caught his reflection in the darkened window. The hollows under his eyes, the sharp line of his jaw where weight had fallen away, the way his shoulders curved inward as though his body was trying to make itself smaller, to take up less space, to disappear the way he had disappeared at 17. He looked, he realized with a cold shock, exactly like his father wanted him to look. Diminished, defeated. Omega, in the worst way the word could be wielded. Jin gave him 3 weeks before his patience broke. It happened on a Friday evening in the penthouse apartment that Jin used when working late in the city. Tay had gone there to drop off revised plans, intending to leave them on the kitchen counter and go. But Jin was home, waiting, clearly, because the door opened before Tay could knock. "We need to talk," Jin said. "I just came to drop these off." "Sit down." It was not an alpha command. It was a request from someone who was running out of patience for watching the person he loved self-destruct. Tay sat. Jin sat across from him, close enough that cedar wood reached Tay's skin, far enough to give him space. "Something happened," Jin said, "after you came out. Something that scared you badly enough to make you start building walls again. I've watched you do it for 3 weeks and I've respected your space, but it's getting worse. So I'm asking you, please, tell me what's going on." Tay looked at his hands. They were shaking. "My father is trying to have my architecture license revoked. He filed a complaint with the Oregon board, fraudulent designation on my application. If they investigate, I lose everything." Jin was quiet for a long moment. Then, very carefully, "Is there legal grounds?" "I listed myself as a beta on my original licensing application. In 2014, designation was still a required field. So yes, technically, he has grounds." "And the inheritance challenge?" Tay's head snapped up. "How do you know about that?" "Because I pay attention, Tay. Because your shoulders have been around your ears for 3 weeks, and you flinch every time your phone rings, and you stopped eating lunch, and I have spent the last 21 days trying to figure out what was hurting you without overstepping, and I am done watching you carry this alone." His cedar wood surged, not dominant, anguished. An alpha's scent when the omega he cared about was in pain, and he couldn't fix it. Tay closed his eyes. "I don't know how to let you help me. You start by saying yes. It's not that simple. Then make it that simple. Say yes, Jin. I'll let you help. Say yes, I don't have to fight this alone. Say it even if you don't believe it yet, and I'll do the rest." "I don't need you." The words came out before he could stop them. Automatic, defensive, the same wall he had thrown up 1,000 times. "I don't need you to rescue me. I'm not some helpless omega who needs an alpha to fix his life." But his scent, his traitorous, honest, uncontrollable scent flooded the room with vanilla and white tea, raw and desperate and reaching for the cedar wood like a hand reaching in the dark. Jin looked at him, looked at the man saying one thing while his body screamed the opposite. And slowly, deliberately, he stood, walked to the front door, and locked it. The click echoed through the penthouse. "I heard what you said." Jin turned back to face him, and his eyes were burning. "Now hear me. I'm not rescuing you. I'm standing next to you. There's a difference. And I'm locking this door because you've spent your entire life walking away from people who wanted to love you. And tonight, I'm not going to let you walk away from me." The wall inside Tay didn't crack. It shattered. The sound that came out of him was not a word. It was a sob, raw and ugly and 13 years in the making. He pressed his hands over his face, shoulders heaving, vanilla pouring off him in floods. And Jin crossed the room in 3 steps and gathered him up, pulling him into his chest, his arms wrapping around Tay's shaking body with a strength that was not dominance, but refuge. Tay cried. He cried for the 17-year-old who walked out of his father's house with a duffel bag. He cried for the funeral he never attended. He cried for every morning he had pressed scent patches onto his skin and told himself this was living. He cried until his throat was raw, until his body was hollow, until there was nothing left but the warmth of Jin's arms and the steady beat of a heart that was saying, in the only language an alpha and omega truly share, "You're home. You're safe. I've got you." When the tears finally stopped, Tay whispered against Jin's chest, "I'm terrified." "I know. If we do this, If I let you in all the way and it falls apart, I don't have anything left to hide behind. Jin pulled back just enough to look at him. His thumb brushed tears from Tay's cheek. His cedar wood was soft, so soft, wrapped around Tay's vanilla like a hand cradling a flame. Then we don't let it fall apart, he said. You can't promise that. I can promise that I'll fight for it. Every day. Is that enough? Tay looked at this man, this alpha who had sat in a chair all night during his heat without touching him, who had made him breakfast, who had learned how he took his coffee, who had restructured meeting schedules around his comfort, who had never, not once, tried to use his designation against him. Yes, Tay said. It's enough. What followed was a war on two fronts, and for a while, it felt like losing. The legal battle with his father consumed months. Jin brought in the So family's legal team, specialists in discrimination law, who argued that requiring designation disclosure on professional licensing applications violated federal anti-discrimination protections. But Jae Kang was relentless. He hired private investigators to dig through Tay's past. Depositions surfaced old colleagues who had suspected, old roommates who might have noticed the suppressants, old landlords who remembered the scent neutralizers delivered monthly. The investigation spread through Tay's carefully constructed life like water through paper, softening every wall he had built. The worst moment came during a preliminary hearing, when his father's lawyer read aloud from Tay's original licensing application, the section where designation was listed as beta, and asked calmly, "Did you knowingly enter false information on a legal document?" Tay sat in the witness chair, his vanilla bitter with stress, Jin watching from the gallery with hands gripped white on his knees, and said, "Yes, because the alternative was not having a career at all." The room was silent. The court reporter's fingers paused on the keys, and across the aisle, Jae Kang looked at his son with an expression that was not triumph, but something more complicated, something that might have been shame quickly suppressed. The case drew media attention. An Omega architect, secretly practicing under a beta identity, now fighting for the right to keep the career he had earned on merit. Social media erupted. Editorials were written. The architecture community rallied in ways Tay hadn't expected. Colleagues testified to his competence. Former professors submitted letters of support. A petition with 12,000 signatures landed on the Oregon board's desk. But the board moved slowly, and during the months of uncertainty, Tay lived in a state of suspended terror. He designed buildings during the day and dreamed of losing everything at night. There were mornings when the anxiety was so thick in his scent that Jin would find him in the kitchen at 4 a.m, unable to sleep, and would simply sit beside him in the dark and let his cedar wood fill the room until Tay's breathing slowed. "I'm sorry," Tay said one of those mornings. "For what?" "For all of this. The mess, the legal fees, the fact that your name is in the papers next to mine, associated with scandal. My name has never been in better company." "How can you say that? This could damage the firm. Your investors, your board, they must be furious." Jin took his hand. "Let me be very clear about something. I would burn every building I've ever owned to the ground before I let anyone take your license. You earned that license with your talent and your work and your brilliance. The only fraud was the system that made you lie in the first place." The Oregon board, facing a public relations nightmare and mounting legal pressure, quietly dropped the investigation and began the process of removing designation requirements from future applications. Tay's license was secure. The inheritance case took longer. His father's lawyers were aggressive, well-funded, and motivated by spite. But Jin's legal team was better, and eventually the court ruled that the trust was irrevocable, and Tay's mother's intent was clear. The money was Tay's. It had always been his. After the final ruling, Tay received a letter from his father. One line. Your mother would have been proud. He read it 7 times, then he folded it and placed it in a drawer and closed it. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but an ending, clean and necessary, to a chapter that had defined too much of his life. Through all of it, Jin was steady. He did not rescue. He stood beside. He held Tay's hand in courtrooms and cooked dinner when depositions ran late, and made sure the Waterfront Commons project stayed on schedule, because he knew Tay needed to see something he built with his own hands rise from the ground. And rise it did. The Waterfront Commons opened the following September, nearly 2 years after Tay's first day at Evergreen. It was beautiful. Affordable housing with floor-to-ceiling windows and rooftop gardens and community spaces that felt like living rooms. The neighborhood association called it a miracle. The architecture press called it visionary. Tay stood at the ribbon cutting with Jin beside him and felt, for the first time, that every year of hiding, every sacrifice, every painful step toward honesty had led to this moment. After the ceremony, they stood alone on the rooftop where they had shared their first kiss. The city spread below them, golden in the autumn light. I have something for you, Jin said. He pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. Not a ring box, smaller. Tay opened it and found a single key on a leather cord. The house in the West Hills, Jin said. I bought it 6 months ago. I've been renovating it. 4 bedrooms, a studio with north-facing light for your drafting table, and a garden. I designed the garden myself, which means it will probably need to be completely redone by someone who actually understands plants. Tay stared at the key. You designed a garden? Badly, by all accounts. For me. For us, if you want it. Tay looked up. The autumn sun caught Jin's face, and his cedar wood was warm and open and absolutely certain. I spent 13 years telling myself I didn't need anyone, Tay said. And then I met you, and you didn't try to be needed. You just were. You were there when I was hiding, and you were there when I stopped. You were there when I fell apart, and you were there when I put myself back together. And every time I said I didn't need you, you listened to what my heart was actually saying. That terrifies me, but it also makes me braver than I've ever been. He closed his hand around the key. Yes, he said. Take me home. Jin's smile was sunlight after rain. He pulled Tay close, and on the rooftop of the building they had created together, he kissed him, slow and thorough, cedar wood and vanilla intertwining in the autumn air until the 2 scents became indistinguishable. One new thing that smelled like permanence and trust, and a future built on the truest foundation either of them had ever known. 1 year later, on a Sunday morning in the West Hills house, Tay woke to cedar wood and the sound of rain, and a feeling he was still learning to name. Jin was already awake, propped on one elbow, watching him with the expression that still, after all this time, made Tay's heart stutter. You're staring, Tay murmured. I'm appreciating. Tay smiled. The garden was visible through the bedroom window, improbably alive despite Jin's design, thanks to the professional landscaper Tay had quietly hired 2 weeks after moving in. Raised beds held late-season herbs. A dogwood tree, planted the day they moved in, was shedding red leaves into the wet grass. I've been thinking, Tay said. Dangerous. About the empty bedrooms. Jin went still. His cedar wood shifted, warmer, deeper, the scent of an alpha responding to a possibility he hadn't dared to voice. What about them? He asked carefully. They're very nice bedrooms, good light, quiet. Seems like a waste to leave them empty. Tay. I'm saying what I think I'm saying. Say it anyway. I want to hear you say it. Tay turned to face him fully. This alpha who had never commanded him, never claimed him, never made his designation feel like anything other than a gift. This man who had locked a door not to trap him, but to keep him from running away from love. I want a family. With you. I want to fill this house with noise and mess and little shoes by the door. I want to build something that lasts. I spent so long believing that being an Omega meant being less. You showed me it means being brave enough to want everything. Jin's eyes were bright. He pulled Tay against him, pressing his face into the curve of Tay's neck, and breathed, deep and shaking, into the scent gland that Tay had hidden for 13 years, and now offered freely. The cedar wood and vanilla merged, inseparable, a single complex scent that smelled like permanence. Then we build it, Jin whispered. Together. The way we build everything. Foundation first. Outside, the rain fell on Portland, on the waterfront commons where families were waking in homes Tay had designed, on the Hawthorne Bakery where a cinnamon roll had once been the bravest act of love Tay had ever received, on the West Hills garden where a dogwood tree was putting down roots in soil that would hold it through every storm. Months later, on a spring evening that smelled like wet earth and cherry blossoms, they stood in the kitchen of the West Hills house, and Tay held up a pregnancy test with hands that were shaking. Jin looked at it, looked at Tay. His cedar wood went absolutely still, the way the air goes still before something enormous happens. Is that, he started. Positive. 6 weeks. The doctor confirmed this morning. The sound Jin made was not a word. It was a breath, a prayer, a breaking open. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and gathered Tay against him so carefully, so gently, as though the Omega in his arms had become the most precious thing in the known universe. A baby, he said against Tay's hair. Our baby. Our baby. They stood like that for a long time, swaying slightly in the kitchen light, cedar wood and vanilla wrapped around each other so tightly the scents could never be separated again. On the counter, the pregnancy test lay beside a half-finished cup of ginger tea, and the dogwood tree outside the window caught the last of the evening sun, its branches reaching upward in the patient, certain way of things that know they have all the time in the world. 8 months later, their son was born in the early hours of a Tuesday morning. Tay labored for 14 hours, and Jin did not leave his side for a single second. The alpha held his hand through every contraction, his cedar wood modulating instinctively to soothe, to steady, to communicate in the deep biological language of designation what words could not adequately say. You are strong. You are safe. I am here. When the doctor placed their son on Tay's chest, the world went quiet. Not silent. Quiet. The hush of something beginning. The baby was small and perfect, with dark hair and his father's determined brow, and a scent so new it was barely there, just a whisper of something warm and sweet, like vanilla and cedar wood mixed with morning light. Jin leaned over them both, one hand on the baby, one hand on Tay's cheek, and his eyes were wet. He's beautiful, Jin said. He's you. He's us. They named him June, meaning bright and brave, and brought him home to the West Hills house where the garden was blooming and the empty bedrooms were no longer empty, and the front door had a lock that meant safety, not confinement. On June's first birthday, Tay received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a small wooden box containing a single photo of his mother, young and laughing in a garden, her Omega scent practically visible in the joy of her expression. On the back, in his father's handwriting, were 3 words. She loved gardens. Tay placed the photo on the mantel in the living room. He did not call his father. He did not need to. The gesture said what 13 years of silence could not, and forgiveness, when it came, would come in its own time, like a building rising story by story toward light. That evening, he sat on the porch of the West Hills house with June sleeping against his chest and Jin beside him, and the city of Portland spread below them in amber and blue, and the air smelled like cedarwood and vanilla and the specific, unmistakable fragrance of a family. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Tay said. "The East Wing cantilevers again?" "No," he smiled. "That night, in the penthouse, when you locked the door." "What about it?" "I told you I didn't need you, and my scent was screaming the opposite. And you, instead of walking away like every person in my life had trained me to expect, you stayed. I locked the door. You locked the door, and that terrified me, because it meant I couldn't run, and running was the only thing I knew how to do." Jin's arm tightened around him. "And now?" Tay looked at the garden, at their sleeping son, at the man who had taught him that vulnerability was not weakness, that need was not shame, that an omega scent telling the truth was not a betrayal, but a homecoming. "Now," he said quietly, "I don't want to run anymore. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And in their bedroom, wrapped in cedarwood and vanilla, two people who had spent their lives building walls finally rested in the home they had built together. Not perfect, not without cracks, but structurally sound, designed to weather anything, and filled, at last, with light. The end. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the story, tell us your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Until next time.